from their ashes new worlds are formed. The superpower of the world, the British Empire, has long since fallen. So what is the future of these peoples, cultures and traditions? The remnants of the British Empire can now be classified as the Anglosphere. This term originates from Neil Stephenson in his book The Diamond Age, where he describes the English-speaking world as the Anglosphere. However, the idea predates this. In the books, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples by Winston Churchill, he simply uses the term English-speaking peoples to discuss what we now refer to as the Anglosphere. But what the Anglosphere really is the nations and cultures that share British historical, cultural and political ties. This idea is very much categorised in George Orwell's book 1984 with the nation Oceania. Oceania is born from the unifying of the USA and remaining British Empire and their respective spheres of influence. The main Anglosphere nations are the USA, UK, Republic of Ireland, Australia, Canada and New Zealand, as they can all trace their descendants back to the British Isles. But other parts of the empire and beyond can be seen and are part of the Anglosphere culturally in some way. The inner core consists of Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand and Australia, collectively known as CANZUK, as well as the Crown dependencies and overseas territories of the CANZUK nations. The outer core consists of the Republic of Ireland and the USA and the USA's overseas territories. The mantle consists of constitutional monarchies within the Commonwealth and other culturally close Commonwealth nations. And the surface level consists of the other Commonwealth nations and other culturally close nations who are not in the Commonwealth. The Anglosphere has consolidated distinct national and cultural identities that all in some way share a unifying identity. We will now be discussing the different elements of what unifies the people around the world within the Anglosphere. The first and most obvious is the English language. English is still the dominant world language and also the language of business, although not the most spoken by population. It is the English language that best allows the Anglosphere to spread its culture across the globe, such as the use of the English internet, English novels, English movies and of course English songs. English is a very adaptable language, such as the assimilation of foreign words and the wide amount of dialects. A great example of this is Jamaica, whose national anthem is in English and their main export, reggae, is also sung in English. They also have their own English dialect, known as Jamaican patois. The bastardisation of the English language into dialects is encouraged and gives each people its own sense of culture under a unifying language. In the British Isles alone, the origin of the English language, there are more than 40 dialects. With the creation of the World Wide Web by the British and the Internet by the Americans, the English language has now strengthened and now dominates the cyber world. Recent studies show that more cyberspace is in English than in any other language. This is only untrue in nations where they heavily censor the Internet, such as China. Even websites coded and designed in other languages still use the English language and coding as a foundation, although it's translated. The English language is also the spearhead of Anglosphere soft power, not only in terms of diplomats rarely needing interpreters, but also in terms of media spread, such as great literary works, music, movies, and even video games. In international politics, discourse is often in and shaped to the English language. Even in the worst case scenario, the English language is here to stay, even if in the future it's only studied academically, such as like Latin. This is because of two reasons. The first being that some of the greatest literary works of all time are written in English. The second being that histories from every corner of the world are written in English, as many of the native populations failed to write down their own histories and instead used oral history. This is similar to Latin, how many of the Germanic and Celtic histories need to be learned and interpreted through the Roman lens. This is just one of the many similarities the British and Roman empires share. I'm sure many of you will appreciate these as we go along, but I will no longer point them out as to save time. The English language also allows for political and cultural movements within the Anglosphere to spread like wildfire. For example, I'm sure everyone around the world heard about Brexit, even though it mattered very little outside the British Isles. But even minor things, tabloid headings, celebrity gossip and such are constantly cross-fertilised with each other. This is both a good and bad thing. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement started in the USA, but then it spread further to the CANZUK nations, even though these nations had much prouder and greater history when it comes to black people and slavery. It, however, also means that this cultural group will slowly merge together more. It is a world-spanning culture that the world has never seen before and that nobody can plan for. Conversely, the strength of the English language, from its base media thread to its dialects, relies on one thing: freedom of speech. Without freedom of speech in each of the English-speaking nations, its strength can be negated and maybe even destroyed. And sadly, only the USA is putting up a good fight in this corner, with freedom of speech in the CANZUK nations being pretty much a myth at this point. It's also too easy to blame politicians for this, as the people vote for the politicians. The fault is with the people voting. Many perpetrate that the Anglosphere is in decline, as proven by the fall of the British Empire. Let's explore this. The term British Empire was only really used by the elites before 1880. If you asked the average Brit about the British Empire before then, they would most likely not know what you was on about, or maybe just think you're referring to the United Kingdom itself. In contemporary times, the British Empire was not seen like other empires, such as the Roman one. This is because the British Empire was never built on conquest, and never had an emperor or empress. Queen Victoria only later adopting the title to better fit into Indian culture. The 13 colonies, Canada, Australia and New Zealand were all just places that the British people migrated to. They didn't go to conquer or subjugate, but instead just to seek a better life. What was later referred to as the British Empire was built mostly by private individuals, not by command. The state rarely ever got involved in this, but when they did, it was when people asked for permission to settle or to go and set up trade monopolies in places around the world. These were seen as commercial ventures to the government, not as conquests. This is not to say that conquests didn't happen, because they did, but they were rare. These places were also conquered only to protect trade and private venture, such as in the case of Egypt. The East India Trading Company, for example, asked for permission to set up a trade monopoly in the Raj. And over time, this company simply expanded on its own. It's only when the East India Trading Company asked the Crown to intercede and govern the Raj that the British Empire could be considered a true empire. Before then, it was just seen as commercial ventures and people seeking better lives. It was really an empire by accident. It was just independent British people going off into the world and doing their own thing. Therefore, it is a myth that we're in decline. What has really changed? We never set out to make a Roman imperial style empire. The only thing that's changed is that the places our forefathers went have now grown into their own independent and sovereign nations that can stand on their own 2 feet. All the trading monopolies have fallen, but in their place westernising and spreading our culture across the globe, such as in India or in the African nations. This, I would argue, is progression, not decline. It could conversely be argued that we have declined as an industrial power. And this is partly true. As the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, you might think that the UK would be more competitive, but not really. It's just that we spread the Industrial Revolution around the world. As standard of living has risen in the UK, such as workers' rights, this is yet to happen in nations like China or Indonesia, where they can still milk their citizens like cattle. The UK is still a top manufacturing nation to this day, ranked around 9th depending on how you calculate things. This is great considering its small size, great workers' rights, and major focus on finance instead of manufacturing. And even better, the manufacturing industries in the CANZUK nations and the USA are hyper-competitive and specialised in things that cannot be easily replicated in other nations that rely on cheap labour. The UK was indeed the workshop of the world, but only declined as other nations copied us. This is normal. The USA's manufacturing industry, for example, is still hyper-competitive to this day. Added to this, Canada and Australia's manufacturing industries are likely to grow as population increases. You could still argue that the Anglosphere economies are as a whole in decline. This certainly does have truth in it, and it's mainly because of mismanagement from the top. However, the decline is way overstated. It looks bad in terms of GDP growth, such as the BRIC nations. But this is a silly way to measure decline. The CANZUK nations and USA are already highly developed nations. It's not that our economies are shrinking, it's that other nations' economies are catching up. Japan, India, China, they aren't doing anything special. They're just experiencing what happened to our nations in the 18th and 19th centuries. We should be instead proud that the world we currently live in is built on and invented by the Anglosphere nations. It is the adventuring, inventive, rebellious and independent culture that is the only thing that makes us special. And these values are by far not in decline. Another clear distinction of the Anglosphere nations is common law. There are two main legal ideologies that dominate the world: common law and civil law. Common law originates in England and is based on pagan Germanic traditions, while civil law originates from France and is based on Roman traditions. Common law is based on case law, meaning each decision is decided on a case-by-case basis using older precedents. If there's no set precedent, then new precedent can alter the law, which means that laws are uncodified. This means that laws under a common law system are based on tradition. A long process of time and thousands of past rulings create common law that is honed over time. Under common law, judges are also elected by the people, and the accused are judged by their peers, not the state. Therefore, common law authority stems from the people. Civil law, on the other hand, is codified, meaning it is written by politicians and government officials. Courts and judges must also use state-backed legislation to come to a verdict, and may not change the law themselves. Civil law is therefore more centralised and based on the power of the state. Civil law also changes all the time depending on politics and the current government in office, and is therefore inflexible. Courts must do what the institutions decide, and all authority lies within the state. This also makes civil law more adaptive and is shaped by the current trends of the time. The laws structuring a nation, from politics, society and ideas of freedom, are obviously a huge unifying factor within the Anglosphere. The British Empire is unique in the fact that it forecasts ending itself by allowing domestic rule after the American Revolution. It didn't commit suicide like every other empire in history. This is because the Anglosphere did not aspire for French or Roman-style universalism, or even high amounts of centralisation. Instead, Britain adopted a system of representative, limited and lawful government throughout all of its dominions. This of course didn't happen overnight, and took many years. This difference is deeply embedded into the Anglosphere's way of thinking. Even the newly formed USA maintained key elements of English common law, some would argue even better than the English themselves in some ways, although it did adopt some French universalism values. After the American War of Independence, which is basically just a continuation of the English Civil War, the British Empire created a system of dominionships, and envisaged that in time they would become self-governing states, modelled on the practices of English common law. A minor unification of common law between the Anglosphere nations is the Privy Council, in which some Commonwealth nations still use as a court of appeal. However, the basic foundations and principles of common law does not require any international structure, although this is something that could be set up for greater integration and cooperation. Another shared aspect of the Anglosphere is the sterling and dollar. While the pound was dominant before the rise of the US dollar, much of the world was in the sterling area. The sterling area was where other nations pegged their currencies to the pound, or just used the pound as their own currency. Many of these nations were part of the British Empire, but a significant minority were not. It started around the 1930s, and by the end of the war in 1945, the sterling area was recognised as the largest and most coherent currency bloc in the world. Canada and Newfoundland never joined the sterling area due to their proximity to the US dollar and how intertwined their economies were, even in the 1930s. The sterling area, however, fell to the wayside and was eventually destroyed when the UK joined the European Economic Community. This severed many trade routes across the world, and most Anglosphere nations would instead peg their currencies to the US dollar instead. This is why so many former British colonies, such as Australia and Canada, use the dollar instead of the pound. but it is still an Anglospheric currency. The US dollar now plays a huge part in unifying the Anglosphere and keeping the world monetary system stable. Another unifying factor is Anglicanism. Anglicanism is basically the English variation of Christianity and has a very British way of doing things. However, most Anglicans are not even English. In fact, most Anglicans now are in Africa. Each country has its own archbishop that rules over their own church. These archbishops are normally a descendant from an English missionary, and this is just one example of how all Anglican churches have some common historical lineage back to England. This again is not run from the top down, but instead each culture has its own decentralised church that are all collectively known as the Anglican Communion, with the Church of England itself only having jurisdiction over England and a couple of other European areas. Although decentralised, they have a common link through the viewing of the Archbishop of Canterbury as their unifying leader. They all also share Anglican beliefs, such as using the Common Book of Prayer. The Anglican Church of the Church of England was not originated by King Henry VIII just so he could remarry, like many historically illiterate people or Anglophobes like to suggest. Its origins in fact predate Henry by about 1,000 years, and Henry just rejuvenated many of its divergences. Because the British Isles are a group of islands, the culture of Italian Catholicism found it harder to maintain cultural dominance here, and many British Christians thought differently. This time of the religion can be vaguely grouped together and known as Celtic Christianity. It had many distinctions from Catholicism, from art to worship. Augustine of Canterbury was then sent over by the Pope to re-strengthen the Catholic Church in the British Isles, and therefore Augustine of Canterbury is seen as a strong figure of Anglicanism, as he brought the British Isles back into the Catholic fold. However, this didn't last forever, and the English people didn't think they should be beholden to the Pope and the corruption in the Vatican, but instead to their king and country. They therefore wanted the King of England to proclaim himself head of the church, which is where King Henry comes into the fold. Henry's succession problems are only one part of the story. Anglicanism is therefore a mix of Protestant, Catholic, Celtic Christianity and Orthodox Christian beliefs, all under the monarch who is the defender of the faith as well as the spiritual leader. Anglicanism is very similar to the English way of spreading its culture. Instead of a top-down centralised system such as in the Catholic Church, where every split becomes a new and separate denomination, Anglicanism has its own devolved and domestic operations all around the world. Although they are all unified by being Anglican, each different culture and nations have a slightly different way of doing things, and this is not discouraged. Anglican believers have a mix of progressive and orthodox values depending on the political and cultural landscape in each country. There are two ways that they do this: through joining the main Anglican Communion or making smaller groups themselves, such as the current Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans, although all of them would still consider themselves Anglican, and the general Anglican worshipper may not even be aware of which organisation their church is in. These groups are more to spearhead debate rather than creating new denominations. This makes Anglicanism stronger than any other Christian domination, as it allows for splits without the need to create whole new denominations and religions. It's very similar to how Hinduism works and why Hinduism is so stable, with every family having different beliefs but all still being unified and considering themselves Hindus and part of the same religion. And this is why Anglicanism is the third largest major group of Christians by number of followers, even though it's a relatively new creation. At the moment, the neutral and more progressive believers remain part of the Anglican Communion, while the more conservative and orthodox believers are part of the Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans. Many Anglicans, however, just call themselves Christians and don't even know they're Anglicans, and this is quite normal in nations where Anglicanism is the majority religion. Therefore, the split in these nations are normally Catholic or just Christian, meaning Anglican. Another huge unifying factor of the Anglosphere is the crown. Descendants of Alfred the Great and beyond, this family and their descendants were the first rulers of the Anglosphere, but are now just figureheads with soft power. The idea of the crown is an intrinsic aspect of England and the UK for many reasons that I don't have time to explore in this video. However, although Charles is the monarch of 14 nations, he's still very much seen as a British monarch, and during his reign and the reign of his mothers, many nations have considered becoming republics. The representatives of the crown still live in the UK and visit the other realms sparingly. Whether the monarchy has the sense to broaden its horizons outside the UK is yet to be seen, but it's unlikely that King Charles III will take this path. Will the monarchy remain a British monarchy, or will it take the plunge and become a true Commonwealth monarchy? Nobody knows. The wider Anglosphere spreads out much further than just the CANZUK nations and the USA, but into many other nations that share common values, traditions, cultures, and a general sense of the world. These brethren Anglosphere nations can be most easily found within the Commonwealth of Nations. Unlike other former colonial powers, the British and Portuguese are unique in maintaining good relationships with their former colonies. Former British territories were not treated as harshly as those from other colonial powers, and now former British colonies are seen as some of the better governed nations in the world, such as India for example, which is the world's largest democracy. Of course, there was some mistreatment, as with every empire and nation's history, but when it did happen it was wildly discouraged and looked down upon by contemporary figures in Parliament and the elites. During World War II, for example, many of these nations would support the empire voluntarily. They truly saw themselves as British and fought with as much courage and bravery as anyone else for their king and empire. These ties and memories still hold on, either explicitly or subtly, in many of these nations' cultures. They are far from being all anti-British and anti-English, as some would have you believe. The former Spanish, French and Dutch colonies, for example, have hugely negative relationships with their former overlords, while the British colonies and the UK decided to create the Commonwealth of Nations to peacefully break up the empire and continue positive relationships, with of course many humps in the road. Nations like Malta, Jamaica, India and South Africa are just a few examples of the huge amount of common ground shared across the globe. There are cultural differences, but these are not necessarily a bad thing. You'll find that most Anglophobes focus only on the negative aspects of empire. But it's important to think critically and to understand the nuances, that there were both good and bad things within the British Empire.
They led us wild lost. They take everything we had, and not just from us, from our fathers, and from our fathers' fathers.
And from our fathers' fathers' fathers.
Yeah.
And from our fathers' 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 fathers.
All right, man, don't labour the point. And what have they ever given us in return? The aqueduct?
Once the Commonwealth was created, the trade relationships blossomed each year until Britain decided to sever its ties and to join the European single market. Since then, the Commonwealth of Nations have limbered on in a sort of diplomatic bond, and it was no longer able to do its intended purpose. Now, since the UK has left the EU again, the Commonwealth could, if the UK had the brains and political competence, reforge its former alliances. Since Brexit, the Commonwealth has grown in size, with former French colonies such as Togo joining to subvert the French corruption within their nation. And yes, the French do still maintain some colonies in the modern day. The Commonwealth could bolster Anglosphere ideas better than anything else, and could act as a huge positive force in the world. If the Commonwealth were to come together, it would be a new world superpower, rivaling China and the USA in terms of landmass, population, economy, and even military power. The Commonwealth of Nations is still heavily influenced by British culture, which still survives in small nuggets all over the world and is very dominant online. And you would be mistaken if you think that the Commonwealth is just the British Empire in disguise. Some colonies have been kicked out of the Commonwealth, and some member states were never even part of the empire. What the Commonwealth really is the alignment of shared history, culture, and Western ideals. But will the Commonwealth ever put its head above the parapet and become a defender of common law, liberty, and free trade? Or will it just remain a weak fragment of the past? Many of you may think that Commonwealth-wide trade would be impossible, but this is far from true. You see, there are two forms of international trade. Common standards, for example, where both or every nation must agree on what a banana is and the quality of it before they can trade it. This type of trade is often overly bureaucratic and creates a huge amount of restrictions on trade, as well as upping the price and lowering the competition. It is, however, arguably safer, but takes away the purchasing decision away from the common people and forcing them into buying only what the state decides is safe for them. The other form is what I like to call reciprocated trust. This is where both or every nation agrees to trust in one another. Basically, whatever your nation considers to be a safe banana, we will agree to, and let that into our nation, and vice versa. Reciprocated trade is much more libertarian and pro-free trade, allowing for better competition and economic growth. Protectionism would also be perfectly fine and would be for every different country to decide unilaterally. This can also allow for devolution away from the state into the hands of a buyer, allowing them to decide for themselves what they want to buy. It is the second option, reciprocated trust, in which the UK, Commonwealth and wider Anglosphere could very quickly build up free trade agreements without the need for big state and over bureaucracy, such as what happens in the EU and other centralised systems. Through this method, the Commonwealth could easily morph into a network of friendly trading nations instead of a bloc. However, it would also be highly adaptive, allowing for mini blocs to form within this network, such as for nations with high standards, such as between the CANZUK nations, India and Singapore, for example. Or maybe mini blocs could form on regional areas and domestic need. This network would be ununified but extremely economically strong. Or it could decide to standardise over time, just using reciprocated trade as a foundation, or only standardising certain things. Another element unifying the Anglosphere is diaspora. The British people spread all over the globe with the invention of ships that could travel further distances. However, it's very hard to measure, as you'd need to track movement from both Great Britain and Ireland, as well as further movement from other nations but do not identify as British or Irish, such as those who identify as just Canadian, for example. The CANZUK nations are all majority British nations, as well as the USA. However, this is much harder to track in the USA, as after the revolution, most of the Americans decided to kind of reject their British ancestry. On census data now, they normally just call themselves American, and this is great because it shows that they see themselves as American and integrate. This stage of British diaspora is huge, as a large problem our ancestors had was population. We had always struggled to compete with nations such as France and Germany, and were always viewed as a small populated nation by some. Things have now changed. The EU is mostly perpetrated to be the biggest rival to the Anglosphere, but their population is diminishing fast, while the USA and CANZUK nations will together overpopulate it in the near future. This will bolster the Anglosphere economies even further. Although our populations should be much better than what it is, we are in a better situation than our ancestors. The reason it's still not as good as some nations in Africa and Asia, for example, is because people aren't breeding enough. This is down to many social reasons, but we are truly failing as a civilization on this front, and it's quite pathetic. So yeah, go out and have some children, people. The main Anglosphere nations are the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. These nations were considered to be an extension of Britain itself. They are essentially the same family, separated by the sea. If these nations were to unite, they would become a new global spanning superstate, with limitless potential that many people are dubbing CANZUK. They all share pretty much the same culture, government structure, history, traditions, and standards of living. Even more, the vast majority of people from these nations can track their heritage back to the British Isles. However, history has proven that the best unifying factor is a common threat. And you might be surprised to hear, but they all do face very similar threats. The UK has always and will always have a tumultuous relationship with other European nations. For example, they're the first nation to have ever left the EU. England is closest to the Nordic countries, who are also sceptical of the EU. Their power links are already linked. They have some of the most stable demographics in Europe, and the UK and Nordic nations together control North Sea trade, with their great naval capacities, which the continent is heavily reliant on, while Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are closest to the Republic of Ireland, whose economy is the golden child of the EU. This is because they all see themselves as Celtic nations. The Republic of Ireland also receives a huge amount of investment from Anglosphere nations, such as the USA. This is mainly down to their low corporation tax of around 12%. However, this being said, the UK is very much separated from the continent and the Republic of Ireland. The European Union feels insulted by the British, and the UK's closest allies are heavily tied to the EU. The UK also mostly feels culturally separated from the rest of the continent, and solely due to geography, as the Eurozone economies begin to fail, so will the UK's. Canada's closest ally is the USA to their south, and they are also highly dependent on the USA. Although they don't feel culturally separated, they do feel overshadowed by the USA economically and culturally. This makes Canada go relatively unnoticed outside of the English-speaking world. Canada is also pretty much fully dependent on having positive relations with the United States, while attempting to balance their own national interest and cultural division. Australia and New Zealand's closest friends and allies are each other, and are surrounded by vastly different cultures and ideas, although they do have a lot of cooperation and trade with other nearby Commonwealth nations. Their main problem is that they struggle to economically compete with low-wage labour economies in the Asian nations nearby, with their main threat being China, who rules over this side of the world. These two nations feel much more culturally separated than the UK, which is why both of these nations attempt to build up closer relationships with Canada and USA across the sea. This is just some of the reasons why the idea of a unified CANZUK gains popularity year by year. As a union, these nations would be so much stronger, have more influence on the world stage, and be able to provide a better quality of life for their citizens. However, they are reluctant to do so due to their freedom and independent-minded culture. Freedom and sovereignty are important aspects of Anglo culture. It is the same wanting for freedom and sovereignty that has been the main strength and weakness for these nations throughout history, while some other parts of the world are all too ready to join into unions and federations with one another. The CANZUK nations have started to recognise this, however, reforging some of their old strength they once held together, such as higher military merging, closer trade relationships, and better intelligence sharing. And since the UK has left the EU, these relationships are getting much closer each day. This would be particularly great for Canada, as they would be the middleman and connection point of CANZUK, while the UK can better drive trade in and out of Europe, while Australia and New Zealand will be able to better compete with the low-wage and authoritarian Asian nations nearby. If CANZUK were to unite, or even just form an economic union, it would stand as the largest bloc on the planet. It would be rich in resources, leaders in terms of emerging industries, be a military and naval powerhouse, and have one of the strongest economies in the world that would only grow faster as they supported one another. It would also have plenty of expansion space for its citizens, who would now have arguably the best standard of living in the world. It would also be of benefit and a great partner to the USA and the EU in promoting Western values throughout the world. It could also support the USA much more in standing up to nations like Russia and China in terms of both hard and soft power. CANZUK united would eventually become the third superpower of the world. CANZUK's merging of military, intelligence sharing, freedom of movement, and stronger economic ties are now constantly talked about. They also vote together in the UN and have done so since its creation. Australia and New Zealand are already particularly integrated, with the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement and the closer economic relations trade agreement that the UK and Canada could use as a foundation point to speed up an agreement between all four nations. This would set up adaptable free movement and free trade agreements that protects and respects all parties. CANZUK could then choose to create a shared monetary mechanism and come to an agreement on international and defence policies, and agreeing upon a simple legal framework or maybe even a Commonwealth Parliament structure, meaning that each of these nations would need to be prepared to give up some level of sovereignty. These agreements would also need to take into account the vastly different geopolitical and natural landscapes of each of these nations. It would also be necessary to build a powerful navy to protect the vast spanning union, which would butt heads with the USA if they start to see CANZUK as a maritime threat. The USA itself would hold a huge amount of soft power in all negotiations between CANZUK. Whether CANZUK would choose to federalise in the same way as the EU or the USA is another contentious debate. However, I believe they could do this because of the cultural similarities. Unlike the EU, which is very culturally diverse with many nations, official languages, legal codes, and systems with a long history of animosity towards one another, the CANZUK nations are already wildly uniform, with the only major difference being currency. Alternatively, CANZUK could just act as a close economic alliance, not federalising or centralising at all, but instead just working together on the international stage as sovereign independent nations, with no supernatural structures at all, just simple collaboration between four friendly nations. The biggest thing standing in the way of CANZUK is simply the long distance and separation between its territories. It's simply easier to trade with and form alliances with those who you're nearest to. However, although it's harder, it's certainly not impossible in the modern world, and it will only get easier as technology improves. The idea of CANZUK also has high public approval according to CANZUK International, and when polled, the people of these nations always cite each other as their closest friends and allies. So at this point, the ball is in the politicians' court. World War I reforged the bonds between the USA and the British Empire, and they only grew closer with World War II. Winston Churchill, being half American, half British, was the first to spearhead bringing the USA back into the Anglospheres fold. This was only helped by his personal friendship with Roosevelt and how the American people also admired him. This was vital, as the British Empire was soon to collapse, and the USA would be much more influential for the spread of Anglosphere culture across the world. The post-war world we live in today was built by the British Empire and the USA. From the creation of the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the IMF, the World Bank, and many more, we are truly living in an Anglo-American golden age, from the blood spilt in World War II. This relationship has been dubbed the special relationship. One of the main arguments for the UK leaving the EU is the fact that the British have far more in common with the Americans than they do with the Europeans. However, post the Cold War, many Anglophobes and Americanphobes have started to subvert this relationship. A good example of this is the bust of Churchill in the USA's Oval Office. It signifies the special relationship and the sacrifice during World War II. Pro-British administrations preserved the bust gifted to the USA, while Anglophobic administrations removed the bust. But regardless of politics, when push comes to shove, the USA and the UK still stand side by side when it matters. Even in the quite Anglophobic administration under Joe Biden, the UK and the USA are currently leading in the Russia-Ukrainian war, while the other EU nations hesitated.
In the spring of 1986, Margaret Thatcher received an urgent and secret request from the American president. Ronald Reagan asked her to let him use British air bases for an attack on the Libyan president, Colonel Gaddafi. The Prime Minister agreed. France and other European allies had refused.
It had the effect of cementing the Anglo-American alliance. There's another point. What's the good of having bases if when you want to use them you're not allowed to by the home country? It made America realize that Britain was her real and true friend when they were hard up against it and wanted something, and that no one else in Europe was. They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak, feeble.
Moreover, half British, half American presidents and prime ministers are still quite common. For example, Donald Trump is half British and has a deep love for Scotland, and Joe Biden bears an essentially English last name. And the current British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was applying to become a US citizen. Public surveys state that the US public feel that their top allies and friends are the UK, Canada and Australia, while New Zealand is sadly forgotten about. However, as Henry Kissinger once said, to be an enemy of the US is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. As the USA begins to be subverted from the inside, due to it being weaker because of the universalist values in its constitution, for example the line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." I'm not really sure how this is self-evident, but it goes against the fundamentals of English Enlightenment, and even basic Darwinism, and it adopts a much more French approach. These ideals were most likely implemented just because it was the thing at the time, with the French Revolution just happening. But either way, these universalist ideas make the USA much more weaker and susceptible to the likes of identity politics, and then these Marxist ideas are allowed to spread from the USA to the rest of the Anglosphere. The Americans are also going to be stuck in an uphill fight against these ideas of universalism and even basic globalism, because they've codified some of these ideas into their constitution. It's also proven itself to be an unreliable military partner throughout history, only joining the world wars right at the end when it suited them, and even in the modern day, such as the abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan, without informing its closest allies. Therefore, the USA and CANZUK should remain close, but it's important that the CANZUK nations stand on their own 2 feet and not become the lapdogs of America. CANZUK must not allow for the USA to spread dangerous communistic and globalist ideas into their nations, but to look after themselves, think for themselves, and do what is best for themselves. If the CANZUK nations were to do this, it would act as a great counterbalance against the subverters within the USA, as not all Americans think in this way. However, they must do this quickly, as the subverters and the infiltration is going at full speed now, even in their own nations. As whether or not it's just a passing trend or not, nobody can say. The alignment of CANZUK and the USA has been happening in the background secretly since 1948, and possibly before. It can be seen today with the organisation of Five Eyes, an intelligence sharing agency. Five Eyes is on the front lines against China, Russia and other international parties. The organisation itself is quite secretive, but it goes much further than just information sharing. It rests on the fact that when the chips are down, the 5 participants trust each other on a political and cultural level beyond the trust that is found between other countries.
Five Eyes works overwhelmingly because there is a cultural and values-based affinity between the 5 countries that is hard to be replicated anywhere else in the world. And that's not a piece of Anglospheric triumphalism, it's just a statement of fact.
Five Eyes is also important because it is structured in such a way that it can survive political change, going above and around current premierships and administrations. It's also considered to be the golden standard of intelligence sharing across the world, combining 5 of the best intelligence services in the world. It's been very recently tried and tested in the Russia-Ukrainian war, with the publicly revealed intelligence from Five Eyes being incredibly accurate. In contrast, the information from French and German intelligence has been laughably bad. Since the rise of China's economic dominance, Five Eyes has pushed for an integrated economic pact between the Five Eyes nations as an aspect of national security since 2021, but they're far from all-powerful. For example, when it announced that China's action is a clear breach of its international obligations under the legally binding, unregistered See-No-British Joint Declaration. In response to China's breaching of the Hong Kong handover agreement, China simply responded that Five Eyes should be careful not to get their eyes poked out. This leaves tens of thousands of Hong Kongers now caught in limbo, and the Anglosphere too weak and spineless to stick up for their British subjects. Many Hong Kongers now hold British, Canadian, Australian and USA citizenship as a backup plan if they need to flee. Another recent example is that Five Eyes was a major player in helping Australia combat China's tactics to break their economy during the COVID shutdown, and this was for the most part successful. The Five Eyes organisation also handles military matters. A good recent example of this is the AUKUS agreement of 2021, which allowed for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines from the UK and USA and other advanced military capabilities. It also undercut a French-Australian submarine deal, cementing Australia's loyalty to the Anglosphere. This deal is great for the Indo-Pacific Anglosphere Command against the rise of communist and authoritarian blocs in the region, with the only people being against it being the Anglophobes, traitors, communists, and of course the French. Another organisation helping this region is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue between Australia, the USA, Japan and India. Other military agreements between the core Anglosphere nations are the Abkhan's Armies Organisation, which helps the standardisation of training and equipment, the Air and Space Interoperability Council, which focuses on Air Force standardisation, Naval Command Control Communications and Computers, which helps the Navy cooperate with one another, Combined Communications Electronics Board, which allows for communications across all the nations, the Border Five, which is an informal forum on customs and border management policy issues, obviously Five Eyes, which handles intelligence sharing, the Technical Cooperation Programme, which integrates technology and science throughout the nations, the Five Nations Passport Group, which handles best practices in the insurance, development and management of passports, Migration 5, which handles the security and efficiency of immigration and border services, and the UK-USA Agreement, which focuses on signals intelligence. The North Atlantic Treaty Organisation is also headed by the Anglosphere nations, but by far the most influential is the USA, and it acts as the main bulwark against threats to the Western world. The USA as a whole protects the whole of the Anglosphere with an inflated military spending budget, and in return they ask that other members spend at least 2% of their budgets on NATO spending, which very few nations do. Out of the CANZUK nations, only the United Kingdom does. In my opinion, the CANZUK nations should be doing more to help ease the burden on the USA taxpayer in exchange for more infrastructure investment. This would be better off for everybody in the long term. But Canada, Australia and New Zealand should get their acts together and pay the 2% that they agreed to. The UK, followed by Australia and then Canada, all have capable militaries with a good amount of military spending. But the USA is by far the strongest. India also have a very capable budget, but an untested military command structure and training. If CANZUK combined their military spending budget, it would be the third largest in the world, larger than Russia and dwarfing any EU nation. The USA and UK also occupy permanent seats on the UN Security Council. However, the UK could designate their seat to CANZUK, which would provide a wider representation to Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Any greater alliance or cooperation between the Anglosphere nations would provide a safer and more secure world for everybody. Upon the fall of the British Empire, lawmakers considered making a new form of government called the Imperial Federation. This new Imperial Federation would replace the British Empire with a federation similar to the USA, made up of Anglo-Saxon populations of the Empire. The idea, however, was seen as outdated in Parliament, and instead the Commonwealth of Nations was formed, with democratic or at least sovereign nation states becoming the new global default. Now times are changing again, but the Anglosphere minus the USA has not changed with the times. Therefore, the nation-states of the Anglosphere are being dominated by other blocs in the world. Some of the blocs around the world that are forming are the BRICS, the European Union, the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Union of South American Nations, just to name a few. A very recent example of this is the Indian claim of renaming itself, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, a Kandbarate, which is obviously just a way to try to unify the nations they share culture and history with nearby. It's therefore important to continue to build up the Commonwealth and CANZUK, just in case the US hegemony fails. When an empire falls, it's the frontiers that break away first. We'll now use Saudi Arabia as an example of how the US hegemony is failing. They are now closening their relationships to Russia and China and beginning to abandon the US hegemony. The Saudis have been propped up by the USA for around 80 years now, and before that the British Empire, but are now breaking away. On top of this, the USA is not being politically tactful, but instead putting American ideology first. The current president, Joe Biden, berates them on live TV, insults MBS, and refuses to even shake their hands sometimes. He also attempted to call the Saudis one time, and they simply refused to pick up the phone. And even worse, Because the USA is the default leader of the Anglosphere, all of the Anglosphere nations suffer. Some people might be happy at the weakness of the USA hegemony, and not want the wider Anglosphere to stabilise things. But who would they rather fill this gap? An authoritative and quite communist China and Russia? The theocratic and fascist Islamic world? The socialist EU globalist oligarchy, who are appointed, not elected? Or maybe the anarchic Spanish or African worlds? Some people think that the world outside of the Anglosphere is all rainbows and flowers, but it's far from it. The Anglosphere's cultural strength is its own weakness. Its need and sense to do moral good in the world has led to its downfall. Part of the culture of the Anglosphere nations is that they need a purpose, a goal to pursue. And this goal is often from their point of view that they're doing a moral good. It's this that led the Americans to spread across the continent, that spread Christianity and the Anglican Communion across the world, that made the British Empire build up their provinces rather than just plundering them. The British Empire used their navy, the largest in the world, to end slavery across the globe at their own loss. They also threatened to go to war with their allies if their allies didn't comply in ending the slavery. And the USA, a couple of generations later, would kill 500,000 of their own population over the same fight over slavery. This constant need to always claim the moral high ground weakens them. For example, do you think that Gandhi would have been allowed to live in any other empire or regime? They're also unique in actively trying to spread individual freedom and British rights to their subject nations, which is why so many of their former colonies are such great nations today. In my opinion, the Anglosphere's biggest problem is the English virtue of being self-deprecating. Many people of the Anglosphere hate everything and anything to do with the Anglosphere, the British Empire and so on. And trying to do anything politically in these nations is hard, since the death of Anglicanism. As although these people are driven by a moral good, they can no longer agree on what the moral good is. And even worse, the moral goods that our ancestors believed in and fought for are now dismissed and spat upon. This has led for the Anglosphere nations to be in a limbo of debate. Virtue signalling being overly progressive or overly conservative, nobody can agree on what is right. Even something as simple as what is a man and a woman is up for debate. One side is overly emotional and ignores basic biology, and the other side is overly cold-hearted and unsympathetic. Many people propose that the idea of the CANZUK nations sharing a common culture is racist, because they're all white nations. However, they would not say the same thing about other blocs, such as China or India. A good example of this is sports teams. In many Anglosphere nations, sport teams often handicap themselves, hiring players not based on merit, but diversity. And this isn't always the case, as many people of other ethnicities and religions also succeed on merit. However, you'd assume that it would be more rare due to the population difference. And if a team just so happens to have only white Anglosphere players, that team is often derided by the Anglophobes. But these same Anglophobes do not argue that, for instance, the Congo or the Chinese teams lack diversity. Apparently, it's only the core Anglosphere nations that need to embrace diversity, no one else. This is not to say that diversity is either good or bad, I'm just pointing out the double standard, and how the Anglosphere nations again hold themselves to a much higher moral standard to the rest of the world. I see this as a strawman argument, and see no real problems with the core Anglosphere nations being majority white. In fact, I find the people saying such silly things are the racists themselves. I'm not sure why they're like this, but they just have an obsession with race and seeing the world through a racial and over-idyllic lenses. And again, these people ironically think themselves more moral than everybody else. There are even holes in this argument. The USA, for example, is far from a white-only nation, with many Hispanics and Africans. And the Anglosphere is based much more on culture than race anyway. And therefore, I think that the people who call the idea of an Anglosphere racist are just revealing something about themselves. Some people argue that the concept of the Anglosphere, Commonwealth of Nations or CANZUK, is just a revival of British colonialism. But I see very few to nobody wanting to see a new imperial empire. The former British dominions can now stand on their own 2 feet and no longer need the UK's protection. But this doesn't change the fact that we would be stronger together. This argument is also quite ironic, as the same people are perfectly fine with the colonialism of Anglospheric nations by other populations. It seems to me perfectly reasonable to want to preserve your own people and culture. It is true that the majority of the people in favour of the Anglosphere want shared cultures, values and traditions to create a more harmonious nation, rather than a multicultural nation that history proves mostly ends in disaster. Surely then, the Anglosphere is the opposite to colonialism, as the nations of the Anglosphere believe in decentralisation and not forcing each other's ideas upon one another. This is the opposite to most other blocs that force everybody to adapt to the same culture. But what these people don't understand is that creating a multicultural nation is far from diverse, but instead just creates a strange hodgepodge. I'd argue that if you're in favour of true diversity, then you'd want Japanese culture and people in Japan, Indian culture and people in India, Mexican culture and people in Mexico, Tongan culture and people in the Tonga, and Anglosphere culture and people in the core Anglosphere nations. Therefore, the biggest thing that the Anglosphere needs to tackle is the idea of globalism. Do they just want their nations to become Economic Sector 12, with no real shared traditions, heritage or culture? Or do they want to retain what their ancestors built with sweat and blood? Will they be citizens of anywhere or a citizen of somewhere? Another colonial argument is that the core Anglosphere nations of Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the USA are built upon stolen land, and that the British people had no right to settle here. But they fail to understand, or just choose to ignore, the nuances of the past, and how differently, and I think we can all agree misguidedly, people fought back then. And by this same logic, no nation in the world would be a nation, as every nation is built on either migration or conquest, and often a mix of both. I think that those proposing a colonial argument have a sense of inferiority, have an anti-Western streak to them, or are just historically illiterate. But at the end of the day, it is not up to them, but up to the Anglo-Spheric nations how they govern their nations. And although we shouldn't ignore their opinions and arguments, we should try to remember that they might not have our best interests at heart.
And one of the very peculiar features about England, which I think has become a kind of disease which has spread to the rest of the West, is the self-hatred of the English intellectual. I mean, it's written about very, very interestingly by George Orwell. You'll remember there's just immediately before, on either side of the Second World War, in which there's that wonderful passage describing the kind of people who read The Guardian, you know, the sandal-wearing Quakerish classes, or invariably vegetarian or vegan, as the kind of people who would rather steal from the poor box than stand to sing the national anthem. And that, again, it goes back to the late 19th century. You've got in the Mikado's in Coco's song in the Mikado of all the people that he hated, it's those who sing the praises of every century but this and every country but their own. And this has become profoundly deep-rooted in Anglo-Saxon culture. It was, I think, essentially snobbery. I mean, English food's utterly disgusting. You know, you really, really must eat French. You know, the English have got absolutely, you give an example, absolutely no sense of style or dress. You know. Englishmen are just so ugly. You again.
This is the best moment of this episode. Please carry on.
You illustrate the point perfectly, and so on. And then, of course, it becomes given an extra crank and edge by race sensitivity, so it now shifts from snobbery to something else, which is that we, of course, as imperialists, are responsible for absolutely all the ills in the world, and then, of course, not only did we have an empire, we had slavery. And so every other culture in the world including China, did not have slavery. And in fact, the peculiar thing about the British Empire is that it may be built on slavery, but it then actually spends more money on eradicating than it ever made from it.
Sadly, you'll find the harshest critics and enemies of the Anglosphere is within itself, from its own people, who see themselves as having the moral high ground and who use emotional rhetoric instead of looking at things logically. This has been a long-running trend in English history, but I now see that it's spread across all of the core Anglospheric nations. Which brings us on to the concept of the Western world. We are currently living in an Anglo-American golden age, with blood spilt from World War II. It is the creations post this war and during the Cold War that make up the Western world. These newly created institutions are based upon Anglospheric ideas of law, rights, freedom, sovereignty, representation, and democratic governance. Even the European Convention of Human Rights was created mostly by the UK, and stems from human rights precedents in common law. Neither the UK or the USA trusted the Europeans on this subject post-war, and although these institutions were created to strengthen the Western world, the protection of the Western world still falls upon the hands of the Anglosphere, mainly the USA. The EU and other Western world blocs are still struggling on the world stage, as demonstrated through the hesitation and chaos during the Russia-Ukrainian war, where it was the UK who needed to take lead in Europe. Therefore, the English-speaking world need to start refinding their backbones. The greatest generation built the world we have today, but it will not last unless we're willing to fight for it. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Without the Anglosphere, the Western world will fall. And it's not fair for the American taxpayer that they need to maintain such a large army for its protection. And although nations such as the UK are doing our negotiated part, it could be doing so much more. If the Western world does fall, it's most likely going to be an authoritarian, communist China that replaces it. The Chinese people have higher mathematical intelligence, political, racial and religious unity, and a single, all-powerful political party. These 1.5 billion Chinese will also soon have a modern military, a corporatist economy, and are all under a single, unified bloc. Even with China's upcoming slump in population and economic troubles, they are still much more stable than the EU, that relies on importing Africans, Middle Easterns and South Asians just to keep their populations stable. The worst that can happen to China is that they'll reform from being communist, but this does not mean that they'll become liberal democracies. In fact, it might even make things worse. Meanwhile, the Anglosphere is split up across the globe with varying amounts of sovereignty and unity. This after the world was handed to them on a silver platter by the greatest generation, and they've nobody to blame but themselves. So let me now ask, who still doubts this? For what reason, religious, cultural, ethnic or otherwise, should the USA and Canada be separate nations? As technology improves and the world becomes increasingly connected, why not unite their collective nation's pride instead of constantly dividing themselves? Everything that is deep-rooted in Anglospheric culture currently stands, but it won't forever unless they protect it. They are the same people with the same ambitions, with only insignificant differences. No other ethnic or linguistic group are as divided as the Anglosphere. The prolonged continuation of their people, their cultures, their heritage, or even their ideas depend on coming together. And the only thing standing in their way is their own self-deprecating nature. So join me on this channel as we overcome this and take pride in exploring the history of the Anglosphere. Its great people, its man-made and natural landmarks, its politics, its major historical events, and everything else. I would go in depth into subjects both popular and niche. Episodes will cover any and all aspects of Anglosphere history.
For it is the doom of men